Chapter 3. Does everyone hate Calvinism? I didn't exactly shoot out of bed the next morning like a rocket. In fact, I think my mind reached the launching pad before my body. I have often wished I could be as awake early in the morning as I am when I go to bed at night, and vice versa. But I did rise before most of the other fellows, including Todd. After gulping down my breakfast, I hurried to my first class, the old 8 o'clocker, which everybody wants on his schedule so he can finish early in the day, but which no one wants to attend. It seemed this morning that Dr. Ambers would drone on forever. My pencil took notes, but my heart was elsewhere. I had a free hour coming up, and I planned to make the rounds of the professors' offices to schedule interviews with them as soon as possible. When class was finally over, I made my way to the closest office of one of the 4 men I wanted to interview, Dr. Lawler. It was right next door to the classroom I had just left. Dr. Lawler taught many of the freshman Bible courses, so I knew him from the previous year, and I hoped he remembered me as well. Besides that, he was a kind and considerate gentleman who was sensitive to the students' needs, and he was always willing to spend time with them. What better place could I begin my time with the faculty on my subject of interest than with him? When I knocked gingerly on his door, I was met with a friendly, "Come on in." I told him I would like to make an appointment with him to discuss an important issue that had unexpectedly arisen in my life. And to my surprise, he responded with, "How about now? There's no better time than the present." I had planned to see each professor later in the week, but before then to lay down a careful strategy for the interviews. So when Dr. Lawler said he was available right now, I stammered for a few moments, not knowing where to begin. Finally, I went with the question that the committee member had hit me with, and I asked, "Dr. Lawler, are you a Calvinist?" A friendly smile curved over his face. At least he wasn't going to get mad at the question. But he really didn't help me much when he replied, "Well, young man, that's a hard question to answer. I suppose some folks would call me a Calvinist, and some folks would say I'm not a Calvinist." I wondered at that time what kind of an answer was that. Was Calvinism so elusive in its definitions that no one could know who or what a Calvinist was? Why the big fuss over the question then, "Are you a Calvinist?" I was about to ask another question to carry the conversation further to more enlightened ground when Dr. Lawler freely continued, "Personally, I don't like the use of theological terms applied to me, and I don't like to put them on other people. Oh, how many phrases we throw around today! Arminianism, dispensationalism, modernism, liberalism, fundamentalism, conservatism, evangelicalism, premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism, pretribulationialism, and Calvinism. Need I say more? Those are man-made terms and man-made systems, and I would not associate my name with anything except that which is taught in the Bible." Yes," I continued, "but don't these terms help us state in the nutshell what we believe the Bible teaches?" "Well, that might be true," he explained, "if everyone used the terms with the same definitions, but when you refer to me with one of your terms, that term can only be true of me if you and I define the term in the same manner. If you mean one thing by a term, and I mean something else by the same term, then I am not what you say that I am. And if I call myself by a term, and you have a different definition of that term than I have, then I am not in your eyes what I say I am. Thus the use of theological terms becomes very confusing." I was really puzzled now, so I asked boldly, "Then, if someone asks me if I am a Calvinist, or if I am something else according to one of these theological terms, what am I supposed to say?" "Well, just tell them that you believe the Bible and it is your authority, and if the Bible teaches it, then you believe it. If the Bible doesn't teach it, then you don't believe it. It's that simple." It may have sounded simple to him, but it didn't to me. I was more confused than ever. Seeing I was getting nowhere and not wishing to offend him by further probing, I thanked Dr. Lawler for his time and excused myself. On the way back to the dorm, I thought of several questions I should have asked him. If one cannot use any terms to refer to his beliefs, but can only say, "I believe the Bible," how can we even use the term Baptist to refer to us as a group of people? Doesn't that term speak of some theological beliefs? Further, don't different people say that the Bible teaches different things? How are we to distinguish true doctrine from false doctrine if we don't use some theological terms to conveniently summarize our position? Finally, if you can't use theological terms, then you can't use any terms, even Bible terms like justification and redemption, sanctification, etc., lest someone else have a different definition of the Bible term. One could only say, if the Bible teaches it, I believe it. One could never say, I believe in justification, out of fear someone might define it differently. Such logic would destroy communication altogether. After all, words are symbols for concepts, and if one cannot use any word as a symbol for a concept or concepts for fear he would be misunderstood, then he couldn't even speak, let alone preach. Why hadn't I thought of these arguments when I was in Dr. Lawler's office? That's the way it is in so many of my theological discussions and debates. I think of all the answers after the debate is over. But still, I guess it's better to think of them after the debate than not at all. When I walked into my room back to the dorm, Todd met me at the door smiling from ear to ear. "Guess what?" he exclaimed. "You're engaged again," I shot back, getting ready to give him another congratulations. To be honest, I had lost track of the number of times he had been engaged his freshman year, and really I couldn't be very enthusiastic about another one. I had been bracing myself for the first engagement of his sophomore year. "No," he said with a frown. "The church called, and they wanted you to call them back about a trial sermon date." "Trial sermon? Me? A trial sermon? Whoa!" The date for the trial sermon was set for the last Sunday in October. Really, it would be trial sermons, as I would preach for them Sunday morning and Sunday evening, after which they would vote to call me or not call me as their pastor. Could it be that I was just a few days away from being a pastor? Now I had two things to think about, the trial sermons and the answer to the question, are you a Calvinist? My next interview with a faculty member was several days following the initial one. I was to meet with Dr. Sisk in his office at 4 o'clock that day. He taught church history and seemed to be a very knowledgeable man, and he was also open to the students. I had decided in the interval between these interviews to take a different approach than I had with Dr. Lawler. Instead of asking if he was a Calvinist, I was going to be more subtle. It seemed that the question, are you a Calvinist, immediately put men on the defensive. So I began a little differently with Dr. Sisk. I said, Dr. Sisk, I have run across a situation in a local church where I need, if it is possible, to know the definition of a Calvinist. Could you help me? I had been careful to add the if it is possible in case he answered like Dr. Lawler. How surprised and happy I was when he said, "Well, let's see if I can help you," he continued. "Calvinism is a system theology which has been very influential down through history since the Reformation times. It is named after its founder, John Calvin, who was also the founder of the Presbyterian denomination. But by no means has Calvinism been confined to Presbyterians. Why, even some of our greatest Baptists of the past were Calvinists. The early Baptist movements in England and in the United States were very strongly Calvinistic." That was news to me. And it would be news to Todd, the smoke blower, who was convinced that all Calvinists were Presbyterians. Further, that meant that if Baptists had been Calvinists, then infant baptism was not the heart and crux of Calvinism. Wrong again, roommate Todd. Dr. Sisk continued again. "Why don't I suggest some books for you to read on the subject now? And when you have finished them, we can get together and talk about what you have found." Gladly, I accepted his list, which included Sermons on the Sovereignty of God by C.H. Spurgeon, The Sovereignty of God by Arthur W. Pink, and The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination by Lorraine Boltner. I recognized the name Spurgeon as the greatest Baptist preacher of modern times. I just had to ask Dr. Sisk, was Spurgeon a Calvinist? "Absolutely," he replied. "A 5-point Calvinist?" I asked, glad that Charlie had given me the acrostic. "Absolutely twice," Dr. Sisk declared emphatically. I so much appreciated Dr. Sisk's help, but I had to ask 2 more questions before leaving to do some reading. Does Calvinist view of predestination and election torpedo evangelism and missions?" I asked, using Charlie's words. The question came in light of Spurgeon's Calvinism. Didn't seem consistent that Spurgeon could be a Calvinist if that view killed missions and evangelism.
"No, not necessarily," he replied. "Some Calvinists, who we call hyper, have been extreme in their views and have denied the necessity of evangelism and missions. But some of the balanced Calvinists, like Spurgeon and George Whitefield, and others, have been some of the greatest soul winners of church history."
"One more question, Dr. Sisk. Are you a Calvinist?" He smiled and laughed a little.
"No, I would say I'm about a 3 or 4 point Calvinist. I have trouble with limited atonement and irresistible grace."
I left his office much more satisfied than after the interview with Dr. Lawler. I had a list of 3 books to read, and I was much the wiser. I had learned all Calvinists have not been Presbyterians. I had learned that infant baptism was not part of pastoral and Calvinism, and I had learned that some of the greatest Baptists in history had been Calvinists. And I had learned that Calvinism does not necessarily kill evangelism and missions. I had learned that there are balanced Calvinists and overbalanced Calvinists. I had learned that the average person, including preacher boys I had talked to night before, didn't really know very much about Calvinism. And I had learned my search was just beginning. Before doing anything further, I decided to make my last professorial interview. This final meeting was with Dr. Bloom, who taught theology. He was a brilliant man, so brilliant that most of the students hadn't the foggiest idea what he was saying in class. When a student would stop his lecture for a question, he would get very upset. Then, as he answered the question, we could usually understand what he was saying, but the only problem was that he answered questions almost half mad. If anyone ever doubted his view, he became very upset and even castigated the questioner. Thus, I entered his office several days later at the appointed hour. I sat for almost 5 minutes, which was his usual practice. Many said it was to humble the student and to show him how important the professor was. I wondered if he had forgotten me. Finally, he looked up and, not even smiling, asked me what I wanted. I began carefully. "I have run across a problem in a local church, which requires me to understand what Calvinism is. Could you help me?" Well, I must have struck tender nerve because he took off.
"I don't know why anyone would want to study Calvinism. It is the most absurd system of theology ever to exist. I do not know how anyone could possibly believe that God before eternity began sat on his tyrannical heavenly throne and passed the human race before him, and in arbitrary dictatorial manner chose to save some and damn others."
Then he recited a poem God would have supposedly spoken before eternity, when he chose the elect and did whatever he did regarding the non-elect. I must say, he recited this piece of poetry with much bitterness and spite, which made me feel quite uncomfortable.
"Eeny, miny, miny, mo, unto heaven you will go. Eeny, miny, miny, mo, you will make the fires glow."
Then turning to me with fire in his eyes, he asked,
"Is that the way God did it, young man?"
Honestly, I wished he would stop so I could excuse myself and leave. But he was not about to end his tirade.
"Calvinism is totally unscriptural. It is akin to blasphemy. It presents a God of injustice and terror. Some Calvinists have even declared that the streets of hell would be paved with babies who are not of the elect. If you want to find out about Calvinism, go read about how John Calvin killed Servetus."
He was beginning to irritate me now. I had only come to get light and understanding. I was not a Calvinist, and so his words were not applicable to me. I felt he was being unfair and unjust by accusing me of being a Calvinist, with all of his supposed atrocities of Calvinism. I shouldn't have done it, but I just couldn't resist it. I asked him, "Sir, where can I find a statement about hell being paved with babies?" I was sincere in the question, but I also wanted to check him in his tracks, because he always said in class, "Don't make a claim in this class unless you can't back it up with documentation." He continued his tirade.
"Young man, I've been studying theology longer than you have been alive. I've studied these issues in the original languages. I have written papers and books for the best publishing houses of the land. I've forgotten more theology than you will ever learn. Don't ask me about documentation. Be a scholar and go and find it for yourself."
With that, he excused himself and turned back to his papers. I managed the week, "Thank you, sir," and left feeling somewhat shaken in my soul. Along with what I had learned from Dr. Lawler and Dr. Sisk, I had now learned from Dr. Bloom that Calvinism is a very controversial subject and that people, even dignified scholars, can get very emotional when they discuss it.